Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some malicious compliance stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who demanded strict adherence to rules and got exactly that, along with the consequences they didn't see coming. Here we go. To this day, I can't look at canned corn without hearing 96 phantom barcode beeps. A few years ago, I worked at one of those massive big box retail stores where the lighting is fluorescent, the music never quite matches the vibe, and management seems to hold weekly contests to see who can invent the most unnecessary rule. I worked on the stocking team, which meant early shifts, heavy pallets, and a barcode scanner that felt like it was permanently attached to my hand. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the rhythm of it. Break down a pallet, scan it, stock it, move on. Efficient, predictable, done. Our store had recently gotten a new floor supervisor named Derek. Derek had the energy of someone who had just discovered the word optimization and wanted to apply it to absolutely everything. He walked fast, talked faster, and loved to say things like, "We need to tighten up processes." The problem was that most of our processes were already tight. The system we used for inventory was pretty straightforward. If a box contained 24 identical cans, you scanned the case barcode, and the system added 24 units automatically. It was simple, accurate, and saved time. One morning, Derek gathered us around the receiving area and announced a new rule. From now on, he said, arms crossed like he was unveiling a corporate breakthrough, no more scanning full cases. You will open every case and scan each unit individually. There was a brief silence while we all processed that. I raised my hand. The system already accounts for cases correctly, I said carefully. If we scan the case barcode, it adjusts inventory by the correct quantity. Scanning each unit's going to slow stocking down a lot. He didn't hesitate. Don't care. One at a time. That's an order. We need better inventory accuracy. There's something about the phrase, "that's an order," that flips a switch in my brain. If you want it done your way, you're going to get it exactly your way. The first day under the new rule wasn't too bad. We didn't get many bulk items, mostly a mix of random SKUs and smaller cases. It was slower, sure, but not catastrophically so. Derek strutted around looking pleased with himself as if he'd personally saved the company from financial ruin. Then came my next shift. I walked into the back room and saw a pallet stacked high with canned corn. 4 large cases, each containing 24 cans. 96 identical, perfectly stackable cans of corn staring back at me. I almost laughed. "Hey," my coworker muttered as he passed me, "you're going to have fun with that." I grabbed my box cutter and carefully opened the first case. Instead of just scanning the case label like any sane person would, I took out a single can, scanned it, and placed it gently on the cart. Then another, and another. I made sure each beep of the scanner was crisp and deliberate. I arranged the cans on the shelf with the precision of someone displaying rare collectibles. Derek happened to walk by about 10 minutes in. "Good," he said, nodding approvingly. "That's how it should be done." I smiled sweetly. "Just following your order." It took me nearly 40 minutes to finish stocking what normally would have been a 10-minute task, and I didn't stop there. Every time I encountered a case of identical items that day, beans, soup, canned tomatoes, I opened it and scanned each unit individually. No shortcuts, no assumptions, absolute compliance. By mid-morning, the back room started looking like a disaster zone. Pallets that should have been cleared were barely touched. Carts waiting to be stocked lined up like traffic at rush hour. Other departments started calling over the radio asking why grocery was behind schedule. "Why's nothing moving?" one of the assistant managers asked over the headset. "Inventory accuracy," I replied calmly. Around lunchtime, Derek came storming into the aisle where I was scanning individual cans of green beans. "Why's this taking so long?" he demanded. I didn't even look up, because I'm scanning every unit individually like you ordered. He blinked. "Well, yeah, but what?" I asked. "You said one at a time, no more scanning cases. I'm making sure inventory is accurate." He said scan them one at a time for better accuracy, so you did. Now he's watching the back room fill up with unstocked pallets and asking why it's taking so long? You're giving him exactly what he asked for. The problem is he didn't think about what it would actually look like. He opened his mouth, closed it, and glanced at the growing line of overstocked carts creeping into the main aisle. Employees from other departments had been pulled to help, but even they were moving at half speed because of the rule. By the end of the day, productivity had tanked. What normally would have been a clean, organized back room looked like a warehouse mid-meltdown. The store manager even came down to see what was going on. Derek was visibly sweating when he approached me again. "Okay," he said, lowering his voice, "you can go back to scanning cases." I paused and looked at him carefully. "Just to be clear," I said, "you're instructing me to ignore your previous order and resume scanning full cases?" He stared at me like I just handed him a legal document. "Yes." "Would you like that in writing?" I asked innocently, just so there's no confusion later. He shook his head quickly. "No, that won't be necessary." The next morning, there was no announcement, no meeting, no acknowledgement of the failed experiment. We simply went back to scanning cases the normal way. It was as if the rule had never existed. Inventory accuracy somehow survived without forcing us to treat every can of corn like a unique snowflake. Derek never brought it up again. He also stopped using the phrase, "that's an order," quite so enthusiastically. I don't know what he expected would happen. Maybe he thought we'd quietly interpret his rule in a reasonable way. But when you hand a team an inefficient directive and insist on blind obedience, you'd better be prepared for exactly that. To this day, I can't walk past a display of canned corn without hearing the phantom echo of 96 individual barcode beeps in my head. And our second story. I used to start early and leave early to match my bus. Jack thought that was unfair. Years ago, I worked as a temp in the HR department of a large newspaper company. It was an emotionally heavy time to be there because our paper had just acquired the assets of another major newspaper that had gone out of business. Every morning, former employees from the shuttered paper would line up outside our building, resumes in hand, hoping for a second chance. You could see the stress on their faces. Some had worked at that paper for decades. My job was straightforward but important. I gathered resumes, handed out packets of job resources, and directed people to apply for benefits they might qualify for. I wasn't making hiring decisions, but I was often the first person they spoke to, and that mattered. A kind tone and clear information went a long way during such an uncertain time. Because I relied on public transportation, my mornings were dictated by the bus schedule. I could either take a bus that got me to the building 40 minutes early or one that would make me 90 minutes late. There was no middle ground. So I chose early. I'd sit outside with a book and wait for the doors to unlock. One morning, my boss, Larry, noticed me sitting outside when he arrived. "You're here awful early," he said, looking slightly concerned. "I take the bus," I explained. "It's either this one or the one that makes me really late." He nodded thoughtfully. "Well, that's a terrible choice to have." He went inside, and later that day, he called me into his office. "How would you feel about adjusting your hours?" he asked. "Come in early, leave early. We can make it official." It was such a simple solution that I almost laughed in relief. The new schedule worked beautifully. I arrived early, clocked in, and used the quiet time to organize paperwork, prep resource packets, and set up the intake area before the rush. When I left in the afternoon, another temp covered the later processing tasks. The workflow was seamless, and Larry even extended my contract from 6 weeks to 6 months. He mentioned wanting to make me permanent, but that required corporate approval. Everything was running smoothly until it wasn't. Larry sent out a memo explaining my adjusted schedule so other managers would be aware. That's when Jack entered the picture. Jack was a manager above Larry and had a reputation for confusing authority with personality. He called Larry into his office and told him that adjusting my schedule was favoritism. According to Jack, there were no allowances for special scheduling needs. I was to comply with the standard assigned hours or be replaced. The next day, Larry told me what had happened. He looked genuinely frustrated. "Is there any way you can get a ride in the mornings?" he asked, "just to match the official start time?" I tried, I really did. I asked friends, looked into carpools, I even checked alternate bus routes. Nothing worked. I told Larry the truth. He thought for a moment. "Keep coming in early," he said quietly. "Just don't clock in until your official start time. And stay until the end of the assigned shift, even if that means waiting for the later bus." That meant I would now sit unpaid in the morning and then wait nearly an hour after work for the evening bus. It wasn't ideal, but I agreed. On the first day of this new arrangement, I arrived early as usual and sat at my desk reading a book. I wasn't clocked in yet. About 20 minutes before my official start time, Jack strode up to my desk holding a stack of papers. "I need these photocopies in triplicate," he said, dropping them down. Before I could respond, Larry appeared beside him. "She's not on the clock for another 20 minutes, he said calmly. "She can handle that after she clocks in and finishes her priority tasks." Jack's expression shifted. "She's here, she can work." Larry didn't miss a beat. "No, she can't. You were very clear about no schedule modifications. She would have been on the clock right now under the previous arrangement, but per your directive, she isn't." That's the moment Jack wanted rigid rules. Larry handed them back to him. If she's not allowed to adjust her schedule, then she's not allowed to work off the clock either. You can't have it both ways. Jack demanded compliance, and Larry gave him a perfect demonstration of what that actually looks like. There was a beat of silence thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack glared and said, "Come to my office." They walked away, and I stayed exactly where I was, flipping a page in my book while pretending I couldn't hear raised voices through the walls. It wasn't a shouting match, but it was close. I kept one eye on the clock. 2 minutes before my official start time, Larry called me into the office. Jack wasn't there anymore. "Effective today," Larry said with a faint smile, "you're returning to your modified schedule. Clock in now." I nodded, trying not to grin too widely. I went back to my desk, clocked in, and made the photocopies before the intake line started forming. The rest of the day ran exactly as smoothly as it had before. Jack never mentioned my schedule again. Over time, Larry's reputation for fairness and practical leadership earned him promotions. He eventually moved into the very position Jack had once held. Watching that happen felt like quiet justice. Larry understood that flexibility wasn't favoritism, it was common sense. He saw productivity as something to cultivate, not something to micromanage. I stayed for the remainder of my extended contract and left with a glowing recommendation. I've worked under plenty of managers since then, but Larry stands out. He had the rare ability to balance policy with humanity, and he did it without making a spectacle of himself. Every now and then I think about that stack of photocopies and how close I came to making them 20 minutes early for someone who didn't believe in compromise. Instead, I got to sit there, unpaid but satisfied, while policy worked exactly the way it had been demanded to. It's funny how quickly rigid rules crumble when they're applied without flexibility. And our last story. We removed the structure neighbor illegally built on our farm. When my grandparents passed away earlier this year, I inherited their farm. Losing them was devastating, and I'd trade every acre to have them back. But the farm itself meant the world to me. My grandfather built the house with his own hands as a wedding present for my grandmother, and every beam and brick carries their story. My husband and I had already been looking for a place closer to my new school. I'm 24 and I just started my first year teaching middle school, so inheriting hundreds of acres of family land felt bittersweet, but also like a gift we wanted to honor. The property is massive, with open pasture, a pond, and a huge wooded area that backs up against a recently built subdivision. Several developments have popped up nearby in the past few years, and one sits directly along the eastern edge of the farm. My grandparents have always kept to themselves and didn't have issues with neighbors, but we quickly learned that proximity doesn't always equal respect. A few weeks after we officially moved in, my husband and I decided to explore the wooded portion more thoroughly. We were walking through the trees when we stumbled upon something that made both of us stop dead in our tracks. There, nestled high in the branches of a giant live oak, was a fully constructed treehouse. Not the kind kids slap together with scrap wood, but something out of a home renovation show. It had proper framing, glass windows, a small deck, and, no joke, a window AC unit installed. "This is not a kid project," my husband muttered, staring up at it. "No, this is an adult with tools and a plan," I replied. The lumber looked new and the structure was sturdy. It was also undeniably on our land. We waited nearby to see if anyone showed up. About 20 minutes later, a man in his mid-30s appeared with 3 kids trailing behind him. He froze when he saw us standing there. "What are you doing on my property?" he demanded before we could even speak. My husband blinked. "Actually, this is our property. We just inherited the farm. We have the deed if you'd like to see it." The man scoffed and told the kids to go ahead and climb up. Then he turned back to us, red-faced and agitated. "Nobody owns this land," he said. "It's been empty for years." "That doesn't mean it's unowned," I said calmly. "You're trespassing, and we can't have a structure like this on our property, especially with children climbing in it. If someone gets hurt, we're liable." He went from confused to furious in seconds. "This is my son's Christmas gift," he snapped. "You can't just take that away." "You built it on land that isn't yours," my husband replied evenly. "We're asking you to leave." He thought empty for years meant nobody would ever come back. That's not how deeds work. Land doesn't become free just because you can't see the owner. He built a whole house up there without checking who actually owned the tree. He stormed off, clearly furious, muttering about how ridiculous we were. As soon as he was gone, we called the sheriff's office to report the trespassing and to document the situation. I may love kids, but I'm not naive. I'm a teacher. I've seen how quickly parents look for someone to blame when something goes wrong. We also contacted a contractor to remove the treehouse. It wasn't about being cruel. It was about liability and property rights. If one of those kids fell and broke an arm, it'd be our insurance, our names, and potentially our home on the line. The structure was dismantled within a few days. The contractor confirmed it had been built recently and without any permits. We donated the lumber rather than let it go to waste. I felt a small twinge of guilt imagining the kid's disappointment, but I reminded myself that the fault lay squarely with the adult who built it where he had no right to. A few days after it was removed, there was a pounding on our front door. The same man stood there, arms crossed, looking like he was ready for a fight. "You stole my kid's Christmas gift," he said without greeting. "We didn't steal anything," I replied. "You built a structure on property you don't own. Legally, that makes it ours. We removed it for safety reasons." He threatened to call the police as if that would somehow intimidate us. "Please do," my husband said. "We already have a report on file." He actually followed through. When the deputies arrived, we calmly presented the deed and the survey maps. The officers explained very patiently that constructing a building on someone else's land without permission is trespassing and potentially criminal mischief. The man's bravado evaporated quickly. He ended up receiving a citation and a fine. Watching him realize he was in the wrong was almost surreal. He kept insisting he thought the land was abandoned. One of the deputies replied, "That's not how property ownership works." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Unfortunately, the story didn't end there. A few residents from the subdivision somehow got our house number and began calling, leaving messages accusing us of being kid haters and selfish monsters. One woman said, "It's just a treehouse. You could have let the children have that." I stood in my kitchen staring at the phone in disbelief. I spend every weekday wrangling middle schoolers and helping them navigate algebra and adolescence. The idea that I hate kids is laughable. What I don't love is being sued because someone decided to ignore property lines. My husband and I decided to take proactive measures. We're installing a privacy fence along the entire side bordering the subdivision and a hurricane fence along the remaining property lines. We're also putting up additional no trespassing signs and security cameras. I refuse to spend my evenings worrying about who might wander into our woods next. We considered involving the HOA from the subdivision, but ultimately decided against it. My grandparents had a long-standing agreement about respecting property boundaries, and I don't want to trigger a cascade of petty fines that could escalate things further. We're choosing to handle it firmly but cleanly. The irony is that if the man had simply knocked on our door before building anything, we might have worked something out. Maybe not a permanent structure, but supervised visits or something seasonal. Instead, he gambled on the idea that empty meant free, and that gamble cost him time, money, and a hefty dose of embarrassment. Let's talk about what each of these stories reveals about assumptions. Story 1. The supervisor assumed that scanning every can individually would somehow improve accuracy without considering the time cost. He didn't account for the pallet of corn, the 4 cases, the 96 identical cans. When the back room filled up and other departments started asking why nothing was moving, he had to personally reverse his own rule. Story 2. The higher-up assumed that flexibility was favoritism. He killed a modified schedule that worked perfectly for everyone involved. What he didn't anticipate was that killing the flexibility meant killing the unpaid work, too. Story 3. The neighbor assumed that land left untouched meant land free for the taking. He built a treehouse, installed windows, added an AC unit, all on property he never checked ownership for. When the actual owners appeared, he learned that empty doesn't mean abandoned. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.